I follow Jacob Geller on Twitter. He's one of my favorite writers and YouTubers on this entire site. His work has inspired me and made me get out of my shell, made me think, made me cry so many times. In some ways, or a lot, you can see his influence on my work. This video isn't about Jacob in any way, but an article he retweeted like a long time ago, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. Usually I like to watch and read what Jacob recommends on Twitter, because he's a smart guy and a great curator of content. The article question isn't that bad. One could say the article's topic is a conversation that we need to have, but the author of the article chose a wrong entry point to the conversation. The topic of the article is misogyny, but the many attempts to start a conversation in gaming discourse have always ended the same way. The male self-identified gamer TM dismissing the topic as woke SGW feminist bullshit. What many well-intentioned writers get wrong about this topic is that attacking the gamer TM only makes him dig himself deeper into his woman-hating community. The article in question is Nikos Deos' opinion piece on Polygon, Endering's Millennia embodies From Software's problem with women. As stated before, this article wants to talk about misogyny, but Nico isn't able to understand Eldering. I think back to The Age of Feminist Frequency and Anita Zakirzian. What a bunch of misogynists use as an excuse to dismiss, to talk about their audience headed for women, was Sarkeesian's inability to understand video games. These channels jumped to these mistakes and made the point that these feminists are wrong and stupid. They cannot understand simple things about video games. Why should we listen to them and their ideas? This article makes the same mistake. It tries to open a conversation about a topic that needs to be talked about in the gaming community, but because the article was written without even considering to understand Millennia or Eldering, it comes as Nico is stupid and has no ability to understand media. A quote from the article: "She is no longer clad in armor, and the camera does a long, slow reveal of her nakedness. Her body is crusted over with rot, and yet reveals her breasts and genitals being as smooth as a doll's. It evokes a confusing mixture of fear and titillation, complicating the act of regarding her body. Her lack of protection does not feel like a vulnerability, but a challenge." As Nico writes, Millennia's second form and reveal is supposed to invoke a challenge to the player, but what Millennia's design is supposed to tell the player is that she's finally able to release her power to be reborn as a phoenix. Her design tries to communicate that even though Millennia is a female, her features of femininity are no longer concern of the battle. That's why they are smooth. If Millennia was supposed to invoke her femininity to the player, those features would be emphasized, as many other characters in From Software games are, from bosses to NPCs, where we see a woman where From wants to emphasize the female features, exaggerate those features. From's restraint from focusing in the sexualization in the design of Millennia shows us that they want to focus to be on Millennia's power and her spreading her wings, to mean that the player has lost not to the femininity of Millennia, but more to the all-powerful winged non-gender phoenix, since from afar, Millennia is viewed as simply a non-binary being. The only part of her design that is supposed to remind us that she is a woman is her right breast, which in normal gameplay is not noticeable. We continue to the article. They are afflicted by gender, and the cure for when there are obstacles, instead of mutually helpful, is for the player to enact sustained violence. It is a particular kind of idealized femininity, as fantastical as the foreboding castles and giant trees. Demure, quiet, void of needs or emotions, an echoed presence of dolls, mothers, and even helpmates who guide the player along. Their emotions are muted in their more docile counterparts, before erupting into a shrieking, horrifying hysteria when encountered in combat. So I'm going to split this section into two parts, to the characters that endure violence and the characters that help the player. The player enacts violence because that's the way the player interacts with the world. The primary gameplay loop is one of violence, and the violence doesn't have a gender. To think that because the player does what he is instructed and that makes him a more deviant is backwards thinking. The women of the Souls games that are there to help the player, the soundness is an illusion. What any character from any Souls game has in common is that at first sight they are shallow and hollow. They are the dressing salad of the game, helping the vibe and aesthetic of the loneliness of the games, but as the player pieces the story of the world, those characters are given depth. They are dull and muted because they exist in a world of misery and death, while they should be hopeful when only a few even seem to experience hope in Souls games. Nico continues to write, From's female characters who deviate from this quiet, doll-like appearance are stated with a lack of emotionality, which feels close to masculine stoicism. It's a strained emptiness that informs every permutation of character that women embody in these games. But what he fails to realize is that emptiness is common to many characters in the Souls games, and some could say that the woman being able to keep their emotions and in a lot of positions be able to lead and organize the resistance against the harsh world, like the Shrine Maiden in Dark Souls 3. She is the one that commands the shrine and the player kneels to her power and authority. While someone could make the argument that these characters fall into the anime style trope that the expert from Matt Kim talks about, that is a surface level reading of the characters of these games. Further down the article, it reads, Malenia's boss fight is punishingly difficult and the audience hostile and competitive attitudes about it are often steeped in gender toxicity. Numerous Reddit posts, YouTube videos and tweets talk about players' failures or successes, while littered with sexist slurs. People also fell back into the usual community discourse about which methods of beating her were more valid and which was made you a pussy, and that success offered her took on a weird masculinized chest beating at times. Nico isn't able to understand is that the people that call Malenia such slurs and the ones that are simply toxic about being her, i.e. the general Souls game fan, are fundamentally different. The toxic audience of Souls games, which players gatekeep people for not doing things the right way or beating a boss in a way that makes you a pussy, is an outright sexist, since that toxic community is more interesting to gatekeep the game, whether that would be towards women or men. It doesn't matter to these people. They want to be recognized for their skill and want to feel superior to the other players. The people calling Malenia such slurs may intertwine the toxic community, but the characteristic is more a failure of the character rather than a symptom of the game or its community. You can take Malenia as a case study in that type of misogyny and examine what enrages these people to call Malenia designed to call upon those feelings and be a symbol of the superiority of the man in all of the stories is reaching in a way I haven't seen before. The problem seems to lie with the person and is no way connected to the systems of the game, except from the fact that it is difficult. Nico continues to explain that Malenia isn't given depth because she is treated more as an aesthetic rather than have a big role in the story, which I find difficult to understand since not all bosses in the Souls games have pages upon pages of lore behind them, and just serve as challenges, and that's what Malenia is. A challenge, the ultimate challenge for the player to test their skills. I feel stopping to quote the article right about now, since the points made until the end are soft repetitions of the previous. As a viewer, you might say, this was just a bad article that was written with a goal in mind. I didn't care how it reached that goal. What does it have to do with misogynistic propaganda? And to that I have to say that you don't know the internet, buddy. As soon as the internet read the article, it was labeled as bad from both gamers, TM, and also sensible people who believe that misogyny is a problem in the gaming community, but the way the article argued about it was wrong. But if you were in that toxic community of gamers, TM, this article is woke propaganda and a prime example of what is wrong with video game journalists. So-called journalists that aren't able to understand a simple thing as a video game. You see, what Nico failed in his article was that he accused of everyone that threw sexist slurs at Malenia to be sexist, but what he didn't understand was that hatred of women comes from the belief that gaming is a male community and the intrusion of females in the space is an attack on the safe space, which is reinforced by big figures in the community in all social media platforms. What we see is that a common person who respects women falls into those spaces through the common interest of gaming and are radicalized by misinformation and media illiteracy and are able to climb out of that hole. Nico's article not only attacks them, but with it also being a bad piece of journalistic work, is a perfect vessel to continue spreading the message of misogyny in the gaming sphere. Misogyny is all over the place in gaming and geek culture, and we should do something about it. But what I have understood while going on deep dives in all right beliefs is that the hardest thing for a person to admit is that they were wrong. What we should do is educate and let people understand different perspectives and the social structures that surround our daily lives. We shouldn't put ourselves above anybody else because we believe we are right, but we should rather help the person, no matter how uncooperative, to reach the truth. While the topic about examining the women in the soul scheme, specifically millennia, seems like it makes sense, the further you look at it, the more it falls apart. It is a whole journalistic piece that resembles a complex puzzle from afar, but when you go up close to it, it is simply a glass onion.